All right. Well, it's good to be back with you today. I was 7 for 7 on those questions, by the way. Yeah, my strategy early on was I forgot to pack exercise shoes, so I didn't get a workout today. So I was like, I just want to get more steps in. And that was working out really well, except every time I would go to the other wall, I would grab a snack for my airport snack game. And so then by the end, I just stayed over there, and that was beautiful. So anyway, it's awesome to be with you. And I loved, by the way, the worship today. Erica, I love that song that you wrote that. It's awesome, and I think it's a really great song for this series as we look at those words from the bridge, fully forgiven, fully accepted, fully restored. I was like, yeah, this is great. And so it's been so fun to be with you this morning. So this particular session, they wanted me to talk about how to foster healthy small groups with Forgiving Challenge. And I've know the team enough and was here another time for a small group training and seen enough of the one today to know that what I don't want to do is sort of give you the why behind small groups, because I think that's what you've already heard. I thought the best use of my time would be to sort of tell you maybe some expectations that you can have that would be somewhat unique with this particular study. And so I've kind of labeled this one 4 expectations for small group leaders of Forgiving Challenge. And as I look at these 4, I think one of them is sort of what to expect in any 40-day challenge. And I say that because I know this is the 3rd time you've done one. And so hopefully that rhythm is somewhat relevant for many of you in the room. Perhaps not. You might be new to this, and this will be your first 40-day challenge, and that's really great. And then 3 of them are really unique to the content of Forgiving Challenge. And because I was so limited in my time last night from Pastor Nick, and he'll blame others, but at the end of the day, it does fall on the lead pastor, right? Heavy is the crown, you know? So suck it up, Nick. I'll weave a couple more pieces of content into the session today. And so four expectations. The first, I would say, is kind of with any of the 40-day challenges, or really even any study, is don't expect perfection, but pay special attention to the day after perfection. In these 40-day challenges, I've never had anyone call, email, or reach out and say, hey, I just dominated your 40-day challenge, did it perfectly. I've never had that happen. I think that'd be cool. And if that does happen, I'm going to be like, great, then you are writing the future 40-day challenges because you're the best. You're obviously, you've got it figured out. And so every challenge is a challenge. And so there are pieces and elements that I think people will do really well with, and there are pieces and elements and challenges that they'll struggle with. And the key is to not expect perfection, but to keep moving. I recently recorded a podcast. By the way, I have a weekly podcast called The Red Letter Disciple. I've actually had your former lead pastor as one of my guests on there. And so we bring in some really great guests. And so in this season coming up, I think the episode's coming out later in the month, but I interviewed a Pentecostal pastor who is a Harvard neuroscientist graduate. And so a Pentecostal ordained neurologist. That's anyway. There's a lot going on up there. But she said something that I've been thinking about a lot lately that at least according to like our brain science, they say it's appropriate and good for us to fail about 20% of the time in life. I thought that's really interesting, that if we're truly growing the way God intended for us to grow, we shouldn't do things perfectly. We should fail about 20% of the time. Because failure isn't bad. It represents growth opportunities. Similar to kind of what I said yesterday, everybody sins. It's what you do after sin that makes the difference of whether you're free or not. Everybody fails. It's what you do after the failure that makes the difference in life. And so when it comes to these 40-day challenges, or really even when it comes to like putting new goals and new habits into your life, trying something new, the most dangerous day is what they call the day after perfection. So think about it this way. If someone's in the challenge, and let's say they're off to a really great start, and they do the first 20 days really well, and then on day 21, for whatever reason, they struggle, the most important day of the challenge is day 22. That's the day where they say, you know what? I failed yesterday, I'm not going to do it, and so I'm done. Or that's the day they say, you know what, I've done 20 really great days, I failed on one, and I'm going to get right back on it. And as small group leaders and as a church and as the pastor, we need to encourage our people that no matter what's going on in your life, that if you failed for a day, especially with the topic of forgiveness and grace, by the way, like let's get right back up on it and let's keep going. I can't hammer this point enough for you guys. I don't know what else you want. Those are sound effects I asked to bring in. I'm really excited about that. Timing.
So you know, next door, for those of you who aren't aware, they're putting in a Dollar Tree, and it would appear that they are working on it today. So we apologize for the noise, but you can add it into your script all you want.
There you go. And so pay really careful attention to that day after perfection. And really, I think that's the message we need, again, when it comes to grace and forgiveness in our spiritual walk. I think people are too hard on themselves a lot of times, especially as you guys looked at that spiritual engagement journey today. It's awesome if it's linear and moves perfectly forward all the time. I've just noticed it doesn't do that in most people's lives, that there's ups and downs, and there's times forward and backward. And that's important to know in that journey. It's awesome to have that journey. I love that journey, by the way. I'm going to take it home. And anyway, it's awesome. But when it comes to this, like think about it. If you've done 20 really great days and you failed on day 21, I think God would say, I'm really proud of you because you're 19 steps ahead of where you once were. And that's a really good thing. That language is really great in addiction recovery as well. When people have 100 days of sobriety and struggle on day 101 and think, well, what am I going to do? So it's the day after perfection that as small group leaders, I want you to pay attention to. And I mentioned a piece of this yesterday, that in the other 40-day challenges, Red Letter Challenge, which I'm so grateful that 3 of you remembered that. Praise God. No, I've forgiven you, though. It's all good. But those 5 targets are being, forgiving, serving, giving, and going. Being, forgiving, serving, giving, and going. And in that challenge, I really think that it got more difficult the more people got into it. In other words, especially those last 2 targets of giving, that generosity, and then going, which is kind of a speaking about or declaring. Those are the difficult pieces of discipleship for a lot of people. And so it got harder as the challenge continued to go forward. Whereas, again, if we look at that forgiving challenge acronym of SCARS, you can see that, right? You can see that, as I said yesterday, the tough sledding is going to be in those first 2 phases. But if you can get people to pass through those, and here's the cool thing. Usually we introduce something new, they'll at least give you their first moments anyway. So if you can keep pressing in those first couple phases, they're going to have awesome freedom when they hear God's words of absolution, the declaration of the forgiveness of sins, that it's been paid in full. Then when they hear that not only that, but you are not just fully forgiven, you're fully accepted, fully restored, redeemed. And then when they start to walk in and see that God has something for them and has a calling on their life, whether it's not ministry for everybody, but everybody has a calling in their life, and when they step up into that. And so the more we can press into, if you've struggled, get back on it, because I think they're going to experience really great freedom in this series. Here's the other thing I noticed that's unique about Forgiving Challenge. As small group leaders, there's some studies that, lots of studies are very helpful. This one, be ready to go deep really quickly. I've been a part of many small groups and many small group studies in my life, and it could have just been my group that I was in, but I've never been a part of a study that had more engagement, like right off the bat. I'm serious, like the very first question, the people that, by the way, didn't know one another got really vulnerable and deep from the very, very beginning. And so I hate to bring the high expectation because maybe your group won't experience quite what I did, but this was the opening question that man, people just really jumped into. Nearly everyone has a scar somewhere on their body. Tell the story behind one of your scars and why it may or may not be meaningful to you. And man, that question just opened up a really awesome conversation that set the tone for the rest of the 40-day challenge. And I think that's the power of SCARS. Not only is it a powerful acronym, but it's also sort of has a double meaning throughout this, that God brings healing into some of our deepest, darkest moments, and he gets inside of that so that that wound can heal, so that now we can help bring freedom to others. And so you'll hear the story in a video, but I'll share a little bit of the story of my scar that I remember. And in my journey, I really felt, again, I said a little this yesterday, like my love for God was blossoming in high school, really becoming my own for the first time. And I felt called into ministry. I'm a fourth generation Lutheran pastor, and so maybe it's somewhat in my blood, but I really felt like that was what God was calling me to do in 9th, 10th grade. And that was great, and I was excited about it first, but then I got more and more involved in like just wanting to be in this world and sort of have my own journey. And so by the senior year of high school, when someone would ask me, what do you want to do when you grow up or in your life, I would say anything but a pastor. And yet I still had this nagging feeling like, but I feel like that's what God called me. I ought to do that. And so I actually had enrolled at Concordia, Wisconsin, and I went into the school, and I was going to go in undecided as a major. And that was sort of like what was going on in my brain, because like I felt like I ought to become a pastor, but I didn't really want to in that moment. I wanted to pursue a different path, and so I'll just go in undecided and delay sort of putting that answer to that question. And so that summer before college was in 2001. And in July 31st, 2001, I was at a Zender family reunion. I believe we were celebrating my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. It was in Angola, Indiana. We got this big old house, and we went out to play golf, and I was driving home from that, and I didn't know the area, and accidentally, never saw the stop sign, ran a stop sign, and was blindsided by a pickup truck that hit me in the driver's side door going 60 miles an hour. And so the car spun out, and I was, of course, knocked unconscious. You can see a couple of pictures of where it hit me. My legs literally had less than half an inch between the center console and where the door caved in. They had to bring the jaws of life to pry the door open, and so I was going in and out of consciousness, not sure what was happening. They threw me on a stretcher into an ambulance, took me right to the hospital. And 2 hours later, I walked out of that hospital with three things. Number one was just a tiny little scar right underneath my chin that you wouldn't know it's there unless I pointed it to you and you had some really high definition cameras seeing it. Number two, they gave me a ticket for running a stop sign. It's like, I didn't see it. We went back later to revisit. Turns out it's like the biggest stop sign I've ever seen. I'm serious. I don't know how we missed it. But third and most important, it gave me a new perspective on life at a really great time in my life. At an age of 18, when I thankfully hadn't gone down a road too far, God came and rescued me. And so I remember hitting my knees that night and saying, God, with the second chance at life, I'm going to do my able best for you and serve you as a pastor in ministry. And that's what I did. And so for me, this scar is pretty meaningful. It's the day God gave me a second chance at life. And it's the day God set my feet on the right path. And a big learning in this study is all of us have scars. Some of them may physically be on our exterior, on our body, but I believe even more than that, many of us have scars on the inside, that we're dealing with things that have happened to us, that we haven't fully healed and reconciled. And so when we talk about scars and when we talk about forgiveness, what I think happens is it gives people the opportunity to give language and words to an area where they know they've needed healing, but they now have permission to talk about it. And so, again, my group, and again, I hope you have the same experience, we went deep super quick. And that paved the way for the rest of the study. And so a couple things as a small group leader. That group promise is on that first week. make sure you go over that, because there we talk about the content a little bit and that idea of confidentiality, that if someone does share something that is deep to them and meaningful to them, they need to know that that's going to stay in that group. So make sure you spend some time on that first week really clarifying that so that people know that it's a safe place. At King of Kings, which is where I serve now in Omaha, we were one of obviously the first churches to go through Forgiving Challenge. We did that when the book came out in, October 2021. And we have a counseling center at King of Kings called the Core Counseling Center that is for our community, but it's also for members of our church. And during Forgiving Challenge, the leader of the Core Counseling Center said that they had 8 times the amount of inquiries that they normally had in a week. And a lot of those were centered around forgiveness and bringing healing to some places and moments. And that's something you should just know as a small group leader, is that there may be things that people bring up that, as great as it is to talk about as a group, some of them need deeper counseling, and normalize that as much as possible, please, because it's a really good thing to get counseling over some of these things. And so, and I would say as a pastoral staff and ministry staff here, arming your small group leaders perhaps with names and numbers of some Christian counselors you trust would be a really great thing. So that's number 2. Number 3, don't be surprised if people do other stuff. That's what I've noticed in the challenge world. When you challenge or ask somebody to do something, especially in our world today where it's like, don't tell me what to do, they'll have 3 responses. They will do it, they won't do it, or they'll just do something completely different. And that's okay. And so that's what I've noticed in the challenge space. And so I remember in our second book, Being Challenged, you guys went through that a couple of years ago. There was one time where I challenged somebody to read a specific, in the challenge for the day, it was to read a specific set of verses and then answer a question or two. The person didn't do that. Instead, they decided, I'm not going to do that, but I am going to read through the entire Gospel of John today. And he did, and it was the very first time he'd ever read through the Gospel of John. And it opened up his eyes to who God is and how much God loved him. And then he set a Bible reading plan to read through the rest of the Bible. It's like, that's actually way better than the challenge I asked. Great. And that's what I've been pleasantly surprised by is, maybe people don't always like to get boxed in, but at the same time, they know that they need something different. And so they're okay being challenged, but they may want to just do it in a little different way. And I want to give permission for people to tell you that's okay. Here's what's crazy. In Forgiving Challenge, and again, it's been out almost a year and a half, not quite. Perhaps the number one thing I've heard from like a testimony or emails that they actually get back to me is, hey, Zach, we're going through Forgiving Challenge, and I just felt like in this challenge, God put it on my heart to call my sister, to call my uncle, to call my brother, my dad, my old boss. We haven't talked in 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. And anyway, we talked and we're working towards forgiveness. And so what's amazing about that is nowhere in the book do I tell them to ask for or to talk to anyone else about forgiving someone else. With one caveat, I do on day 41, the very, very end. I talk about, now that you've been forgiven, take this forgiveness and give it away to somebody else. But people are doing this in the middle of the challenge. And I think it's so powerful and so awesome. To me, it's the power of God working in them. Is they're actually interacting with and receiving this forgiveness from God, and they're recognizing as they go through these phases how that's needed in a relationship with someone else. And so I say don't be surprised if people do other stuff. I would also say encourage it. And ask those questions as small group leaders. Is there anything else going on in your life right now that you're feeling or you're doing in this? By the way, on day 41, there's a link to a free ebook that I called Forgiving Others Challenge. I do think it's really important that we take this forgiveness of God to give to other people. And while this is a deep dive for you to receive God's forgiveness, you can truly be free. That's an 11-day ebook that is designed around forgiving others. And so it's a free download for you. There's a coupon code, I think, on day 41, page 265, I believe it is, in Forgiving Challenge. And so feel free to take that and to share that with your group as well. At the end or even during the middle, if people are wrestling with these things, it's really good. And here's what I've noticed when it comes to forgiving others and even receiving God's forgiveness. We talked yesterday about phase 3 and 4, absolution and restoration. And what I've noticed is that many times people will cancel the debt, the absolution aspect for someone else, but there's still an inner attitude that has resentment or anger. So let me break that down a little bit more. We talked just a little bit about that yesterday with an example that I don't think I give even in the book. And it's a silly example, but hopefully it'll help you understand a little bit more of the absolution restoration piece. So when I moved to Florida in 2010 to plant the first church, that was my first call out of seminary. It was a little city called Mount Dora. And I went to Mount Dora, and the very first weekend I was there, I needed gas. And so I went to a gas station, and I put the pump in, and I know the signs say don't leave your car unattended, but I left my car unattended. And I went in and, I don't know, maybe used the bathroom and bought some Jolly Ranchers or something, whatever I did in there, I don't know. But by the time I came out of the convenience store that was attached to the gas station, I noticed that the gas pump was no longer in my vehicle. It had fallen to the ground, but the problem is it was still pumping gas. And so I had pumped, in a 10-gallon car, I had pumped 50 gallons of gas. 40 of that was on the pavement. And so I created, I really arrived in Mount Dora in style, I'll just say that. This really hazardous, flammable experience for the entire city. Set the city on fire is what we wanted to do for Jesus, not literally. But anyway, the bill back in that day, gas was maybe a couple bucks a gallon. And so it was about $100. And I was angry. It was like their faulty equipment. They would say, don't leave the car unattended, whatever. You do that too here in Chicago. I know you do. And so I went in to say, hey, there's a situation and your faulty equipment, it didn't turn off. It actually fell down and still somehow didn't turn off. And so, I'd like a refund for the 40 gallons on your pavement. And what I experienced was one of the rudest customer service experiences. They didn't see my point of view at all. And they were actually angry with me. I'm like, wait, you're angry? It's your equipment. And so here's the reality. I didn't win the argument. Customer wasn't right in that point in their eyes. I canceled the debt. I literally paid for it with my credit card. It was done. But I harbored resentment and anger for that gas station. For the 11 years I was in Florida, every time I would drive by that gas station, especially with my family who was in the car, I would outwardly boo that gas station. And I would say, those thieves, those wicked scoundrels, they will never see another dollar of my hard-earned money ever again. And you know what? For 11 years, I stayed faithful to my promise. And I kid you not, the very final weekend before we moved back to Omaha, I saw these construction trucks and things and right by the gas station, and it had a sign that said going out of business. And on the inside, I was so happy. It's like, thank you, Jesus. I feel like, Jesus, this is sort of the bookend chapter to a great 11 years where you got me and you're telling me I was right all along. It was their equipment that was at fault. And so you're like, really? You're the guy that writes about forgiveness, Zach? Yeah, that's me. So silly example, but I had paid the debt, right? I did. I paid for it, but I still harbored anger and resentment. And with much more serious examples than that, either with God and us or with us and other people, I do feel like there's a lot of debt cancellation, exterior action, but there's a lot of inner attitudes that haven't quite been made right. And what I think Forgiving Challenge really brings light to is breaking those two pieces, absolution and restoration, out. And it gives people an idea to say, oh yeah, I did actually cancel that debt, but I'm still harboring anger over them. I did say I forgive them, but yet I'm still holding their sin against them in my attitude. And so it really gives people a chance to process that. And so don't be surprised if people do other stuff. Actually encourage it and be excited to share. And then finally, be ready to share how God has used your broken past to help others. That's the power of this series. That's the power of even the SCARS acronym and the sort of dual meaning that it has. Is I really believe that the things that have hurt us or taken us down, I really believe that the worst parts of our stories are what God is going to use to help bring freedom to others. And so I want to encourage you as small group leaders to be as vulnerable and open and authentic as you can be about how if God has broken you free out of your past, and how can you use your broken parts of your story to bring freedom to others in their story. Even as I look at my own life, I got to share this week, it was it was National Lutheran Schools Week this last week. And so for 5 days, every morning this last week, I was at Concordia in Omaha teaching the junior and senior high the 5 targets. And I was able to share sort of the broken parts of my story with them and how God has redeemed those broken pieces. So what does that look like for you? One of the pieces of content I didn't share last night that I just love, the more I looked into this, and is what Peter does with his life. I really believe that from chapter 89 on, I'm not saying he lived perfectly. Even in the Bible, we have a couple of fights that he and Paul get into. And so there's still some stuff in his life. But I believe that Peter's gotten so content with his own brokenness that nothing was going to stop him. And so one of the cool stories to back this up, of course, I told you yesterday, and we have scripture that talks about how he preached in front of thousands. And so, the mouth that at one time was the broken piece of his story would actually bring freedom to others. We talked about how he was faithful all the way to the end and even flipped upside down, crucified and died for the sake of following Jesus. But here's what I think is even more fascinating. There's 4 gospel accounts in our Bible, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, filled with 89 amazing chapters. And scholars believe that despite the order they sit in our books, that Mark was the first one chronologically written. Except Mark wasn't an eyewitness to the accounts of Jesus. Somebody had to tell Mark what happened. And church traditions and early church fathers unanimously tell us and believe that the one that told Mark about all of the stories, the gospel of Jesus, was none other than Peter himself. Church fathers like Papias, Irenaeus, and Origen claim that the gospel of Mark was based on the eyewitness account of none other than Peter. So that would mean not only Mark, but again, if that one was written chronologically first and you know your Gospels, you also know that many of the other 3 Gospels actually borrow from the Gospel of Mark, which means they're all borrowing from the mouth of Peter. And what's cool is in Peter's own retelling of Jesus, he's gotten so content with his own brokenness that he's willing to highlight the character and nature of Jesus, but he's willing to do it by showing us how broken he is. Here's the conclusion. Peter told these stories of him at his worst so that you could see Jesus at his best. Like how free are you at this point when you're able to tell how much you failed him and how awful you have been? Like Peter's so content telling that story so that we would see his brokenness in order that we would see Jesus' grace. And I really believe there's power in that. That the same mouth that denied Jesus in front of one servant girl, that now preached in front of thousands, is now the one that we can attest to much of what we know about Christ because the words came from Peter's mouth himself. How can you be any freer than that? And that's what I hope you experience or have experienced or will experience. That's what I hope your small group experiences, is that we can become so content with even the worst parts of our stories, because we know God's grace is there. We know he's brought healing. And now we're going to use those hard, broken parts of our stories to help bring freedom to others in the future. That's going to change Lisle and Naperville, Chicago, and the world, is when we catch this freedom. Amen? Amen.